Okay, so we will start now, if that's okay with all of you. So good evening for those of you who are following us from India, and very good morning to you, Nikhil. Thank you for accepting such an early invitation. I hadn't realized it would be that early for you. I'm sorry about this. It is our great pleasure to welcome this evening Dr. Nikhil Menon, who's a historian and an assistant professor at Notre Dame University. Nikhil first studied at the University of Delhi and JNU before doing his PhD at Princeton University. His research explores the histories of democracy and development in independent India. He recently published his first monograph, which he will present to us this evening, entitled Planning Democracy, Modern India's Quest for Development, which was published by Cambridge University Press in other parts of the world, but here in India, it was published by Penguin under a slightly different title, Planning Democracy, How a Professor, an Institute, and an Idea Shaped India. And for those of you who've read the book or who've had a quick look at it, you will know that this title refers to Professor Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute that he established, but it also refers more largely to many institutions, including the Planning Commission, which was established around the same time to drive India's development in the wake of independence. The book received much critical acclaim. It won the Joseph W. Elder Prize in Indian Social Sciences. And before that, Nikhil had also received the Mahoney Prize from the Society for the History of Technology for an article from the same research project, which looked at India's first computers. And I'm guessing that this article would be the one that was published by Modern Asian Studies, Fancy Calculating Machines, Computers and Planning in Independent India. Nikhil, if I'm wrong, please correct me. Nikhil's work was also published in the journals The History of Ideas and in the Indian Economic and Social History Review. And I must say, Nikhil has a knack for good titles. I particularly like the one from the Indian Economic and Social History Review, which is Battling the Bottle, Experiments in Regulating Drink in Late Colonial Madras. Beside this monograph and these articles, Nikhil also co-edited a book with Gyan Prakash and Michael Lafan on the post-colonial moment in South and Southeast Asia. And he's now starting a new research project on India's cultural diplomacy after independence, a history of the Indian state's pursuit of soft power. So today, as I said, he will present his book, Planning Democracy, how a professor, an institute, and an idea shaped India. And the presentation will be followed by a discussion led by Dr. Boishak Chakrabarti, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the CSH, at the Centre de Sciences Humaines in Delhi. Boishak is a historian. He was trained at JNU and at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in economic, financial, and community histories in the late 19th and early 20th century in India. His PhD dissertation was on gambling, speculation, commodity exchanges, and the making of the small investor in colonial India from 1867 to 1943. His research interests cover political economy and the histories of finance capitalism, colonial law, agrarian studies, colonial governmentality, as well as empire and state making. This discussion will then be followed by a Q&A with the audience here at the CSH as well as online. For the time being, we'll ask all those of you who are following us online to please be muted. And of course, we'll be more than happy to take your questions during the Q&A session. So the floor is yours, Nikhil. We are delighted to welcome you this evening at the CSH, and thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Laurence, and thank you to the CSH for the invitation. Thank you, Boishak, for agreeing to be a discussant, and all of you for being here on this sort of late evening. This talk, as Laurence suggested, is based on my book that came out less than a year ago in early 2022. Since we are possibly on a tight schedule, without further ado, I'll just jump right into it. But first, I should share my screen. Let's get this going. Can you see the presentation? Okay. All right. Beginning in the middle of the 20th century, the Indian planning project was one of the post-colonial world's most ambitious experiments. Between 1950 and 2014, the Indian economy was a planned economy, as many of you know. The five-year plan was chosen as the vehicle to overcome centuries of colonial economic exploitation. It was a novel experiment that put together a sort of arranged marriage between Soviet-inspired economic planning and Western-style liberal democracy, particularly at a time in which the Cold War portrayed them as both ideologically contradictory, but also as institutionally incompatible. With each successive five-year plan, the Planning Commission set the course for the nation's economy. Sorry, should be able to. Its pronouncements rippled across the land, across to every farm and factory in India. My book explores how planning became so central to the story of modern India, how it became almost an obsession from the 1950s onwards, and something that was once seen as something of an adventure, something that I think is quite hard to recapture today, especially after the neoliberal turn of the 1990s and decades of market-led growth. We've forgotten how mainstream socialistic planning once was. But without understanding that, I would argue, it is hard to make sense of why five-year plans were once a theme in the popular culture of an early independent India. Why, for example, did five-year plans show up in plays, novels, and major Bollywood movies and songs? My book tries to recapture that time and recreate that period and explain why that was. And so it's not just about the economy, but it also uses planning as a lens through which to understand the Indian state after independence. It is about, as I said, the economy, but also about the ways in which planning captured the imagination of India's elite and its public. So during the formative decades of the Indian Republic, planning was an idea that governed India, so much so that it often became the butt of cartoonist jokes. As you can see here in a cartoon from Shankar's Weekly, here Shankar is making fun of how there was a plan seemingly for everything in independent India. There's an economic plan, a transport plan, and of course the butt of jokes in this sort of sexist rhetoric is that there is even a plan for a daughter and a wife, etc. The plans were meant to be the route to rapid economic transformation, and it also became the language through which the aspirations for nation building were expressed. It became a fixture in the national conversation. By the time India became independent, planning had been a popular idea for at least 2 decades. Over the 1930s and 1940s, planning was a dominant idea across the Indian political spectrum. Its supporters, the supporters of planning, included prominent engineers like Meghnad Saha, Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya, major anti-colonial thinkers and leaders like Subhash Chandra Bose, Rabindranath Tagore, Jawaharlal Nehru. But also, and I think something we forget, is that planning had backers within the titans of Indian industry all backed planning of some sort or the other. So J.R.D. Tata, J.D. Birla, Lala Shriram were all backers of planning of one kind or the other. Planning was also an idea that was popular outside of India. In the mid-20th century, there were planned economies in China, the Soviet Union, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, France, Mexico, Argentina, Ghana, Sudan, Tanzania, amongst many, many other countries. So in some ways, planning in India and planners in India were just swept up in a global wave. Now, my book tries to use planning, as I said, as a lens through which to understand the Indian state and the nature of Indian democracy after independence. What it tries to do, and I sort of trying to summarize the arguments on the slide here, it interprets planning as a mode of nation building, as a mode of state formation, and a form of legitimation of the state in the aftermath of empire. So the history of planning that I narrate is a history of the state's capacities, and the state's posture towards its citizens. The first half of the book looks at the technocratic and high modernist aspects of the post-colonial state. It argues that planning triggered the development of a knowledge infrastructure, infrastructures that dramatically expanded the state's footprint, especially its ability to discern and govern the economy. This new knowledge infrastructure, which included an elaborate statistical system and a pioneering computer program, made the economy legible to the state and has ever since been critical to the country's development ambitions. The legacy of this process, of course, endures in institutions like the Central Statistical Organization and the National Sample Survey, both of which remain essential to policymaking to this day. I tell this first half of the book through the story of a fascinating character, that of P.C. Mahalanobis, Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, a brilliant scientist, India's foremost economic planner in the early decades, and one of the most influential Indians of his generation. Along with the professor, as I referred to him, the story is also told through the meteoric rise of an institution, the Indian Statistical Institute, which went from being merely a sort of out-of-the-way academic institute to being the country's foremost policymaker and influential policymaker in the 1950s and early 1960s. But rather than a biographical account of an individual and an institute, my argument is more structural. My argument is that there is a structural transformation in the knowledge infrastructures of the Indian state in the years after independence, and that this structural transformation is enabled through someone like Mahalanobis and the institute that he is at the helm of, which is the Indian Statistical Institute. In other words, it was planning that induced the explosion of the state's quantitative capacities, which then pried open the space for a statistician like Mahalanobis to sway economic policy. So while the first part of the book analyzes how the drive for numbers, data, and counting accelerated a drift towards technocracy, the second half of the book reveals how the sort of contortions necessary to square that technocracy with a popular democracy. It flips the narrative of these elite technocrats like Mahalanobis on its head and looks instead at how the government tried to make planning popular amongst India's hundreds of millions of citizens. Gripped by planning, independent India erupted into a rash of statistics. In the 5 years following decolonization, there was a spasm of official statistics. Spurred by a number-hungry state and moved by the impulse to plan, India quickly mounted a national statistical infrastructure. India had quite simply fallen in love with numbers. National statistics, it was agreed, were an urgent prerequisite for national development. And this faith in numbers was not just limited to the subcontinent. India, like several other countries, was swept up in a global mid-century wave of what has been called quantitative positivism. At the very center of this transformation was P.C. Mahalanobis. Born in 1893 in colonial Calcutta, Mahalanobis grew up as a culturally refined physicist, being educated at both Presidency College in Calcutta and then at King's College in Cambridge. He was brilliant, he was charismatic, serious, and self-assured. He was also multifaceted. He was well-versed in ancient Sanskrit texts, possessed a very discerning ear for Bengali poetry, being something of a pupil of Rabindranath Tagore, an expert in his works, but he was also a dabbler in architecture, though if you believe his colleagues from that time period, he was not very good at it, but no one had the heart to tell him. Mahalanobis was also someone who was animated by a sense of purpose, someone who wanted his academic work to matter for the nation. His interest in statistics began quite by accident, and for a few decades, he wore two hats, that of a lecturer back in Presidency College, but also as India's leading statistician on the side. Over time, Mahalanobis became a global pioneer in the use of large-scale sample surveys, which he conducted through the Indian Statistical Institute, which was, of course, founded in the early 1930s. By the time of independence in 1947, Mahalanobis was internationally recognized for his contributions to sample surveys, which were increasingly coming to be used across the world. Over the next 2 decades, over the 1950s and 60s, Mahalanobis would design the National Sample Survey, which we use till today. He would bring India its first 2 digital computers, and he would author the second 5-year plan, which, as most of you know, broadly laid out the template for Indian economic policy till liberalization in the early 1990s. Soon after independence, the country's political leadership was bemoaning the lack of data about the economy. As Nehru said, quote, "We have no data, and as a result, we function largely in the dark." It was to meet this need that the National Sample Survey was unfurled in 1950. It was a response to the Indian state's need for data to plan the economy, and it was a giant leap. Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute ran the show. The idea was to begin a series of sprawling nationwide surveys to capture information on all aspects of the Indian economic life. The logic behind it was that since it would be impossible or too expensive to collect statistics from each household across the nation, it would then be better instead to develop a representative sample so that the whole could be calculated from a small fraction. This is, in a sense, what sample surveying is. It was the biggest and most comprehensive sampling survey ever done in the world. The challenges were enormous. The initial sample that they arrived at was 1,800 villages out of 560,000 villages in India. The institute, which is the Indian Statistical Institute, was short-staffed and needed to negotiate 15 languages and 140 local systems of measurement. Mahalanobis would write in his diary about the forested areas in Odisha, where investigators had to be accompanied by armed guards through forests and snow-clad Himalayan passes, about encountering Adivasis in Assam who didn't speak any known language. In other parts, investigators often fell ill due to tropical diseases or feared for their lives because of the presence of man-eating tigers in these forests. But the results were quite transformative. They were extraordinary, providing an amazing level of detail about the daily life of Indians. Since then, the National Sample Survey has consistently yielded fine-grained detail about Indian economic life, helping assess poverty, employment, consumption, expenditure, to name just a few of the things that are done with an NSS data. Furthermore, it has made contributions to global policy making. The methods pioneered by the National Sample Survey are now used by the World Bank and the United Nations in their household surveys conducted in more than 100 countries. But this sudden gushing fountain of data posed its own problems. How are you supposed to crunch all these numbers using just human beings? But of course, there was a revolutionary new technology on the horizon, one that caught the eye of the institute and the professor and this new nation state. These were, of course, computers, and they became an obsession for Mahalanobis, who spent a decade and a half bringing India its first two digital computers. The international pursuit of computers by the Indian Statistical Institute and the Indian government was fueled by the belief that computers were essential to economic planning in India. Centralized planning depended on the ability to calculate masses of data, such as that which was emerging from the National Sample Survey, and computers presented a revolutionary means to calculate such data. And so from when Mahalanobis first laid eyes on an electronic computer, the Mark II at Harvard in 1947, Mahalanobis was smitten. He believed that computers would prove vital to the task of addressing India's economic problems. And digital computers, of course, could perform calculations at complex mathematical solutions at hundreds of times the speeds that human beings could. And the professor saw that they would be of tremendous help in tabulating and processing the data that was emanating from this new survey that he had helped bring to India, the National Sample Survey. So in the book, I track the travels of the professor through the American East Coast, through the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and Princeton, where he first sees computers in action, to Europe and then the Soviet Union, from where he's able to bring India her first digital computers. We must remember that these were not just the first two computers in India, but these were some of the earliest computers in Asia. India, in fact, had the first digital computers in Asia outside of Japan. The reason that these machines were so hard to procure was because they were very rare. There were very few of them in existence, and their cost was astronomical. One machine, for example, the UNIVAC, or the Universal Calculating Machine, an American computer, had become well known enough in American popular culture to be in comics and cartoons at the time. Its cost, however, as I said, was quite outlandish. One of these computers cost $1 million and $200,000 per annum more for its upkeep. And of course, the processing power of these computers, you might imagine, is less than that of the phones in your pockets right now. So it either had to be bought by the government or more realistically donated to India. So through the chapter on the computers, I recount stories of how India's hunt for computers was complicated by the Cold War environment in which India found itself, divided as it was in a world of two camps, that of the capitalist democracies allied with the United States, and those of the communist regimes allied with the Soviet Union, of course. India, as an online nation, was trying to benefit from both. But this posed hurdles for someone like Mahalanobis. For example, as I found in the archives, despite spearheading the chase for computers, Mahalanobis was sometimes the biggest obstacle to India getting a computer, especially an American computer. And this was because Mahalanobis was seen by many Americans as being a Soviet sympathizer and a secret communist. So this is a declassified document from the archives sent from the US Embassy in Delhi to Washington, D.C. And as you can read, it says the problem of PC Mahalanobis is well known to the department. Apparently, Professor Mahalanobis has been trying to secure both electronic calculating equipment and technical assistance from both the US or the USSR. It will be noted that the present position of the embassy and the technical cooperation mission is not to give any assistance to the Indian Statistical Institute because of Professor Mahalanobis' reputation of being at least a fellow traveler, of course, to communism. Mahalanobis and the Institute were still, despite these obstacles, successful in bringing these machines to India, putting them to use for the purpose of development and planning. The history of computers in India, and this is important to note, was very different from their use and history in Europe and America, where they were first used for military purposes. In India, they were used for the purpose of development and planning. In laying out the story, I try to offer an alternate history of India's digital revolution, one that is not centered on Rajiv Gandhi and his sort of computer boys, but instead, and by a sort of liberalizing marketizing state, but instead one that is birthed by a socialistic India rather than a capitalist one. The second half of the book flips this focus from the elites in New Delhi and in Lutyens Delhi and Calcutta to a diverse cast of characters across the country. It focuses on the government's slogan of democratic planning. The Congress Party had committed to this slogan, or rather to this idea of democratic planning, well before independence. I found the earliest reference to this phrase that I found was in Nehru's handwritten notes as early as the summer of 1939. I explore the lengths to which the Indian state went to make the public plan conscious, which is another phrase that became popular in the 1950s, I beg your pardon, plan consciousness or planning consciousness. And I try to highlight the failures and the paradox of these efforts. Democratic planning was meant to be different from communist planning. Persuasion and informed consent were its mantras. India's democratic planning was an ideology that claimed to nurture plan consciousness and produce plan conscious citizens and a state that would walk this tightrope between capitalism and communism during the Cold War. It was the domestic equivalent of what would become non-aligned foreign policy on the international stage. In its democratic avatar, planning functioned as a grand narrative for the nation, diagnosing the country's ills, charting the course for the country's development, and inviting civic partnership. It was a political vision in which the tension between technocratic decision-making and representative democracy could be harmonized in theory, at least. So why was the idea of democratic planning important to the Indian state? One is that there is, I think, despite our cynicism, there is a level of idealism that is hard to ignore, especially in certain parts of the Indian state. Nehru is certainly very idealistic. Some might think more than just idealistic, but just building castles in the sky about this vision of democratic planning. There is also a realistic recognition of limited state capacity, which is the more realpolitik reason for engaging in this rhetoric of democratic planning, which is that the Indian state realizes that the Indian state's capacity is so limited that unless it had citizens voluntarily participating and enthusiastically participating in the 5-year plans, that these 5-year plans were going nowhere. The third aspect is that talking about planning and democracy and linking and fusing the two help to legitimize the state in the eyes of its populace. When you're contesting elections, it is useful to talk about how your economic plans are democratic and that the entire point of the government is to introduce these plans that will help the people, but also help them democratically. This is a cartoon by R.K. Lakshman from a government magazine, Yojana. It was reprinted in both English and Hindi, which gives a sense of the second argument, one of the government's realization of limited state capacity, and gives you a sense of the kind of rhetoric that the Indian government engaged in through the 1950s and 60s. Here, as you can see, the plan is an obstinate donkey that won't budge in the direction of prosperity, and it is unmoved by pushing or pulling, nor is it tempted by the carrot of foreign aid. It makes progress only when people run with it on their backs. The Indian state tried to propagate this message of the 5-year plans through an amazing variety of ways. The government sponsored and encouraged plays, songs, documentaries, Bollywood movies, and even sadhus throughout the 1950s and 60s. And so in the remaining time, I'll try to give you a sampling of this. In the second half of the 20th century, the Films Division of India was the largest producer of documentary films in the world. Its audience was massive, 80 million per week, according to the Films Division. It is telling that of all the films produced by the division, nearly 40% between 1949 and 1972, which is the largest share by a distance, related to development and planning. One such film was Shadow and Substance, which showed an alien visiting an Indian villager every 5 years. The visits, you will notice while watching the film, were timed to match the progress of each 5-year plan, right? So the alien would visit in 1951, 1956, 1961. And through the eyes of the alien, both the villager and the viewer, you, are shown what the government of India wants us to see, which is progress. And so you can see the alien taking the villager on a sort of tour of the country. And there you see steel production going up. You see, as the second 5-year plan unfolds, you can see sort of kacha makans becoming pakka makans. And in the end, this home that is built for this villager is named Sukh Nivas. And as you can see, it has all the creature comforts of the time. And this is, by the way, the only time in the movie in which this villager breaks into a smile. While democratic planning was a state-sponsored campaign, the popular culture of the era also gives us ample evidence of the ways in which planning seeped into the public consciousness. The 5-year plans found their way into commercial cinema and popular movie songs. One of the movies suffused with this planned consciousness, as the government liked to put it, was Khwaja Ahmad Abbas's Char Dil Char Rahein, or Four Hearts, Four Paths. Released in 1959, it starred box office draws like Meena Kumari, Raj Kapoor, and Shami Kapoor. And by the end of the film, all the principal characters are working on building or laying a road to Nav Bharat, or New India. And as a character in the movie says, the road that they're building is no ordinary task. It is a part of our 5-year plan. The 1950s even had a Bollywood song that featured the 5-year plans in its chorus, sung by the iconic duo of Mohammad Rafi and Lata Mangeshkar. Its politics are laid out in its chorus. It says, "Keh do ye gaon ke jaat ko aur sheher ke gentleman ko, kamyab hum karke rahenge 5 saal ke plan ko." Tell this to the Jats of the village and the gentlemen of the city, we will ensure the success of the 5-year plan. In the time that I have remaining, I want to give you a sort of quick tour or taste of a quite remarkable episode of planned publicity and the extent to which some of these so-called democratic planning ventures went. It shows the sheer variety of ways in which the government of India sought to propagate the plans, but also, given the political moment we're living in India, it offers an insight into the ways in which religion, specifically Hinduism, was woven into the political and economic discourse of politics, in the economic and political discourse from the 1950s onwards. On 19th February 1956, Delhi's Birla Mandir hosted an unusual meeting. It was a meeting between government ministers, parliamentarians, and approximately 50 Hindu holy men who wished to contribute to the nation's 5-year plans. They were all there to discuss a curious proposal. The idea was for sadhus, which are, as you know, saffron-robed Hindu ascetics who had presumably given up family and material possessions for a life of spirituality, for these people, for these sadhus, to propagate the 5-year plans. It isn't entirely clear where this proposal germinated, whether it's in government or amongst these holy men, but the seriousness with which the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which is the organization that was created, the seriousness with which this Bharat Sadhu Samaj was treated is apparent from the enthusiastic backing it would receive from religiously minded national figures like the then President of India, Rajendra Prasad, and the Minister for Planning, Gulzar Lal Nanda. Gulzar Lal Nanda, as many of you know, would also go on to was a long-time Gandhian, would go on to become a Home Minister and 2-time interim Prime Minister as well. Apart from playing a crucial role in its establishment, Nanda would also subsequently serve as the chairman of the Sadhu Samaj's Central Advisory Committee. And so close was Nanda to this venture and his public image so thoroughly austere that a cartoon in, sorry, I don't think you can see a cartoon here, but there was meant to be a cartoon here. That cartoons in Shankar's Weekly, for example, would depict him as a sadhu, as bare-chested, ribs protruding, and his hair tied in a top knot. After the Birla Mandir meeting, the 50 sadhus who formed the Bharat Sadhu Samaj would pay a visit to Rashtrapati Bhavan, where the president's palatial official residence. And while the president of India is usually the person, as you know, conferring distinctions upon Indian citizens, this time the roles were reversed. The sadhus bestowed the president of India, Rajendra Prasad, with the title of Sant while chanting sacred Sanskrit mantras. They threw in some flattery as well, likening President Rajendra Prasad to King Dasharath from the Ramayana and themselves to the sages that advised the court of Ram, the court of Dasharath. Their mutual regard was no surprise. Rajendra Prasad, of course, was known as an uncompromisingly religious man who had only a few years earlier inaugurated the rebuilding of the Somnath temple, despite Prime Minister Nehru expressing alarm about this, and about a president who, in the eyes of Nehru, was allying himself to an act of Hindu revivalism while the ruins of partition were still raw. This is also a president who was not bashful about washing the feet of Hindu priests in Benares. So this is someone who is seen as very much someone who is both deeply personally devout, but also seen as belonging in some ways to the sort of the more right-wing faction within the Congress party. But what is happening through the Bharat Sadhu Samaj is that the secular logic of development plans and economic growth is being dressed in spiritual robes and then being disseminated through this religious vehicle, paradoxically by men and women who embodied material renunciation. The Bharat Sadhu Samaj's combination of spiritual and the material proved irresistible to the American press. The India correspondent and future editor of the New York Times, A.M. Rosenthal, reported a piece titled "India's Holy Men Get Worldly Job, Wandering Sadhus Asked to Say a Good Word for the Goals of the Second Five-Year Plan." The idea, as he reported, was to have, quote, the country's hundreds of thousands of sadhus, holy men who wander and preach all over India, to put in a good word wherever they go for the goals of the five-year plan. Another American newspaper reported that India's planning minister was trying to shake, quote, this country's 500,000 Hindu holy men out of their spiritual world into the material world of the five-year development plans. 2 months after the inaugural meeting in April 1956, 500 Hindu holy men or sadhus gathered at Rishikesh on the auspicious occasion of the Ardh Kumbh Mela to convene the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. A reporter for the Washington Post observed that, quote, India's shaven-headed, saffron-robed sadhus or holy men are to help preach the virtues of the five-year plan to the people. They have decided to leave the isolated retreats where they lead lives of renunciation and meditation to support national development, end quote. Those pledging their support to the plans included, quote, sadhus from the south, semi-naked saints from Himalayan caves, ash-smeared wandering mendicants with their begging bowls, and the heads of famous hermitages in the Himalayas. The link between these ascetics, these sadhus, and the ruling party, the Congress, was so evident that the Hindu Mahasabha dismissively referred to the sadhus in the Bharat Sadhu Samaj as Congress sadhus, which is a sort of neat upturning of the politics of today. The allegations of Congress sadhus notwithstanding, the relationship between the Congress party and the Indian government and the Indian government's attitude towards these Hindu ascetics was complicated. While for sure, there were religiously minded people in or associated with government, such as the Minister of Planning, Gulzar Lal Nanda, and of course the head of the state, President Rajendra Prasad, the Prime Minister, for example, took a much more critical view of them. The Prime Minister's view, Nehru's view, was dim at best, and his relationship with them had been testy. Nehru had previously described some sadhus as, quote, lazy rascals, and had publicly scolded them as a group for including many fakes, charlatans, spongers, and parasites, some of whom took on saffron robes and begging bowls just as a costume to avoid work. This is, of course, at a time in which, in the 1950s, there were many reports, such as in the Times of India, about these quote-unquote fake sadhus who had abducted children, kidnapped women, and sort of were abusing children. So this is in the context in which Nehru is scolding them. But by the summer of 1959, Gulzar Lal Nanda had convinced Nehru to personally address a convention of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. Nehru, in this speech in a large Maidan, began by explaining why he was and had been hesitant to speak at a Bharat Sadhu Samaj event. To begin with, Nehru said, as a member of government, he did not know if it was appropriate to associate himself with a religious body. Further, while there were some, quote, great men amongst our sadhus, he said that there were others whom it would be, quote, difficult to even call human beings. Despite these churlish remarks, the Prime Minister received an ovation, and the Samaj's president assured Nehru that his members would cover every village in India carrying the gospel of social, economic, and moral reform. Not everyone, however, could pretend that this partnership between ascetics, sadhus, and the plans was business as usual. As a contemporary political scientist noted, the planning minister's involvement in a scheme to use sadhus to push the 5-year plans in villages, quote, evoked much merriment amongst the cartoonists of the Indian press. This is the cartoon I was referring to earlier. R.K. Lakshman mocked Nanda in a cartoon depicting the minister as a sort of sadhu. On this, of course, Gulzarlal Nanda is the minister for planning at the time, and he is the one on the extreme right. Mahalanobis, just for those interested, is the chef second from top on the left. So as you can see in another cartoon on the right, R.K. Lakshman is showing this person that has wandered into a Sarkari office, and a Babu or a minister has spent hours feeding many cups of chai, etc., believing this to be a member of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, only to find later on that this is a beggar that has just wandered in. On the left is another cartoon in which you can see the planning minister once again learning of these different very complex aspects of governing, like deficit financing and inflationary pressures, etc., from a sadhu. And of course, in Shankar's Weekly, there's this cartoon showing both Gulzarlal Nanda at the front, along with Prime Minister Nehru, both dressed as sadhus, with the question that Nehru has associated himself with the Sadhu Samaj, but for whose salvation? Cartoonists apart, other citizens were also taken aback by Nehru warming to the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which to them suggested a capitulation on the principle of secularism. An editorial in the Times of India bristled at the, quote, confused thinking that was behind inviting sadhus to participate in scientific nation building. Their values, the editorial went on to say, were so clearly out of tune with the spirit of the times. Another concerned citizen, R. Mani from Calcutta, wrote to his newspaper to express displeasure at the surprising spectacle, he said, of the Prime Minister hobnobbing with sadhus. Mani feared that the involvement of Nehru and Nanda in the affairs of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj portended a reversal in the secular policy of the government. The experiment with the Bharat Sadhu Samaj would later blow up in the Congress government's face. In 1966, sadhus demanding a ban on cow slaughter, including many of the sadhus in the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, attacked Parliament and vandalized central Delhi, leading to clashes with the police and leaving several dead and dozens wounded. The sadhus participating in this violence, as I said, included many from the Sadhu Samaj, and the Home Minister at the time was one Gulzarlal Nanda, who was also associated so closely with the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, because of which Indira Gandhi insisted on his resignation. Furthermore, one of the founders of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, Sant Tuktoji Maharaj, would go on to become one of the founding vice presidents of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. And by the late 1980s, the Bharat Sadhu Samaj's meetings started to merge with those of the VHP. Their message, the message of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, by the late 1980s, had transformed from promoting the 5-year plans to now demanding that the Babri Masjid be brought down and replaced with a temple to Ram. And so you can see that this is something, this sort of soft Hindutva, as you might call it today, which begins in the Congress Party in the 1956. Of course, there are Hindutva elements across the political spectrum, but within the Congress Party is associated with something like the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, and that this seed grows into something that would blow up in the face of the Congress Party, not just in 1966 when the Home Minister of India has to resign because of the kinds of elements that have been nurtured by him, but also later on when the Babri Masjid, a sort of a wedge issue that comes comes to be associated with the rise of the BJP is something that is in some ways gifted to the BJP by the Congress through the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, that becomes one of the principal backers, along with the BHP, of the Babri Masjid being raised. The history that my book explores continues to echo in our present time. And here are just some very quick news stories from the past 5 years that show the ways in which the history that I recount echoes with the present. On the campaign trail in our last general elections, Rahul Gandhi talked about scrapping the Niti Aayog and reviving the Planning Commission. Mamata Banerjee, while campaigning in Bengal, in the Bengal election, said that she would institute a planning commission for West Bengal, including people like Amartya Sen and Abhijit Banerjee. And both these news stories gives us a sense of the kind of the long shadow that the Planning Commission still casts on our politics, or that the associations that we have with the Planning Commission still seem to have some resonance in certain kinds of politics, at least. Then, of course, is the question, this is from the Business Standard, of given that, especially after demonetization and the fiasco of demonetization, the search amongst at least India's financial newspapers and financial journalists for someone who will guide the economic policy of this government, to ask who will be the BJP's Mahalanobis. And of course, we have seen, as most of you are aware, in the past few years, the data infrastructure that was built in the 1950s seems to be either under attack or subjected to willful neglect based on your point of view. We've seen different aspects of the National Sample Survey, different surveys either discontinued or their findings suppressed. We found before the last general elections, one particularly important report about unemployment being at a 40-year high was one that was suppressed and was released, I think, by a journalist from the Business Standard. And so you see that in some ways, a data infrastructure that India, regardless of political party, had reason to be proud of as being a trailblazer amongst developing nations, is coming under attack. This is a story from The Economist last year about how India's once vaunted statistical infrastructure is now crumbling. So to conclude, as I've tried to convince you in this talk, planning was quite central to the story of modern India. And in the decades after independence, it became one of India's or the country's meta-narratives. It was present in economics, of course, in politics, but also in popular culture. Even religion, which seems to have so little to do with the 5-year plans, came to be associated with the Panchvarsha Yojana, with the 5-year plans. So I hope that this has offered some sense of what my book argues and the different sites it explores. Thank you very much, and I look forward to Boishak's comments and questions, and to your thoughts as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikhil, for this wonderfully engaging presentation. I will now let Boishak discuss your paper your book, before we open the floor to questions from the audience.
Hi. Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you for a very comprehensive survey-like presentation. I don't think I have to really enumerate the specific arguments of the book. I think you've covered them all. So let me just start with some of the things that I really liked about the book and some of the questions that followed from it after. For those of you who haven't read Nikhil's book, I would like to inform you all that it's extremely well written, very lucid, enough to engage scholarly interest, but also lucid enough for it to be engageable through for a non-specialist or a non-academic reader. And I wanted to comment on the fact that, particularly for history writing, how important narratives are. And I thought that the narrative was extremely compelling, and also that the language itself was quite simple in trying to, but not simple in a pejorative sense, just in the sense that in trying to engage a wider audience. And I found it very compelling. Thank you. So the point regarding the discrepancy or the tension between technocratic state planning and participatory democracy was something that I found extremely interesting. Nikhil effectively shifts the notion of planning from a putative economic ideal in post-colonial India and projects it onto the plane of political representation, which is something that I thought was a specific maneuver of the book itself and one of its main agendas. what did it mean to have a close group of technocrats compiling ideas on behalf of Indians and related to the participative democracy that was promised through the vehicle of the nationalist movement? This refraction is an important question to engage with, particularly in light of what representative democracy and how open innovations of the post-colonial state had to do with what went on behind closed doors. The chapters on data collection and computers are fast-paced and extremely detailed and interesting. The reconstruction of Mahalanobis, or the professor, as Nikhil refers to him repeatedly, is done both sensitively and skillfully. The book highlights the tension of what appears to be a pure technocratic imagination whose sentiment and compassion often appears allied to his love for statistics and a clear epistemological objective rather than a larger compassion for the people. And this is a tension that Nikhil is constantly drawing upon. His disagreements with members of the committee, his role in the institute in Calcutta, and his parallel developmentist visions are brought together excellently. Nikhil also does a fantastic job of showing the levels of difference between Gandhian, leftist, socialist visions of a post-colonial state, especially when contrasted to Nehru and the professor's vision of the nation. Finally, one of the most important parts of the book, and this is something that I would like to raise in the the question-answer sessions itself, is to do with the innovation of the sample survey. How it almost became a metonym for the tension the book is representing otherwise, that is, of the difference between small-scale technocratic visions aligned to the need of large-scale mass participation in planning itself. And this is something that Nikhil brings out in, I think, the second chapter, where the sample survey as an innovative device. And just to give people in this room an idea, Nikhil contrasts the sample survey with empirical surveys of conventional communist planning, where every detail needs to be enumerated for one to actually have an idea about how to manage. This versus, let's say, neoclassical market-driven economics, where models are actually left to something which obviously don't have any kind of state imprint on it. Nikhil referring to it in classical terms of the invisible hand doing all the work. The sample survey then comes to represent something which is neither total enumeration, so therefore all the data doesn't need to be taken into consideration, but rather it's sampling, and the sampling itself becomes the key or the base for a model that can be then conceived in a statist imagination. So these are the things that I found extremely interesting, and some of the questions are to follow from these observations as well. I should also possibly lead with the fact that some of my questions come from the way in which I have approached the economy in my work. And so with that caveat, let me continue. So while this book does not fall within the broader genre of law and economy, of course, it does come under state and economy more directly. And here the omnipresence of the state and its role in directing economic activity is one that is, I feel, of course, given the title and given the nature of the book, but it has to be a little overdetermined. I mean, we're talking about planning here, so of course it needs to be overdetermined. But one does not get a note of the impossibilities of planning vis-a-vis private actors that were first indicated by, let's say, something like the Cambridge School. The notion of private capital appears wedded to large industrialists, which Nikhil brings up, like the Tatas, the Birlas, Goenkas, etc., Dalmias, and their stated adherence or divergence from the plan, and that is done excellently. But to what extent was planning able to account for liminal actors, liminal but very crucial actors of the Indian economy, like Arhatiyas, Amdawalas, Goladars, Sheikhs, Mahajans, etc., and how these actors were brought into the fold of planning, or how they were accounted for within the enumeration of planning, is something that I would personally also be more interested in hearing. To that end, the book starts quite definitively in the post-colonial era. And while there are, of course, flashbacks to the vehicle of the Congress nationalist movement, which then goes on to form the post-colonial state, the break, as the book is located quite distinctly in a post-colonial period. However, for this reader, it would have been interesting to see some of the colonial antecedents that were leading into this moment as well. So Nikhil makes a crucial observation when he says that colonial data collection was done for the convenience of administration, not for planning, which is a difference that he's making between the colonial and the post-colonial states in terms of data collection. I wish we I want him to elaborate this a little further. And for example, my question stems from, let's say, something like the banking inquiry reports and the details and the span of it, and how this kind of data collection, at least from impressionistic accounts, were the building blocks of understanding how the state could enter small-scale agrarian production, both as a lender, as a formalizer of tenancy and land reforms, and as a buyer of commodities. So how does one think in terms of planning versus administration in this context? In a way, can one suggest that shouldn't all data-driven exercises finally lead to some kind of plan or not? And how do you therefore make the difference between administration and planning? In line with this pre-colonial legacy, what was the role of the Congress, a party of revolution and the vehicle of independence, in arresting its own revolutionary impulses? So therefore, if one imagines the Congress to be basically a vehicle of revolution promising change, and then becoming the party in power, which then has to arrest its revolutionary potential. And this is something that has been a point that has been made elsewhere as well, that there was a contradiction of sorts that, most notably, I guess it's been made by Marxist historians as well as leftist parties, that of course, independence was an incomplete project even after it was completed. In this context, the way in which the Congress was both a party of revolution, but then also became a party that had to arrest revolution in India, what were the disjunctures that this actually forced upon it, and how does planning fit into this kind of contradiction? So what was the role of planning and participatory democracy in allowing the Congress to state its objective goals after it had claimed that independence had been achieved? For example, why doesn't the notion of participatory democracy come from the pre-colonial promises of the nationalist movement itself? Why is it something which is starting from a post-colonial state? There remains a tension within the book between the term economy and the category market. While the market is often referred to, it is somehow left to the realm of neoclassical economics, which the book consigns to a transatlantic discourse. But we do not know that but we also know at this time that the market was expanding as well, whether in commodities, derivatives, or in banking. So what was the role and thinking of the technocrats vis-a-vis market expansion? Did they seek to regulate it, control it, or did they work alongside its natural development? To give an example, how did Indian social planning engage with concepts like managerial capitalism that was emerging in America during this period? For that matter, how did they even engage with concepts like trusteeship that come from a very Gandhian school of thought? The sample survey is in itself such an interesting and notable observation in this book. While explained with lucid comprehension, I would have liked to see a bit more of the epistemological considerations that went into its actual functioning. How did planners engage with neoclassical economics at a time when they were neither wedded to socialist total empiricism or consumer economies? Finally, the last section of the book, which is again extremely thick in detail and very fascinating for readers, where Nikhil is talking about the popularization of planning. And in this context, it's possibly the last thing that he mentioned in the talk as well, with the religious idioms and the sadhus getting involved in actually spreading the notion of planning, or actually working alongside the Congress party, both as political representatives, but also as people who are given the task of making a technocratic idea translatable into everyday idioms for Indians. So the tension that you speak of between traditional and the secular is something of great interest, and is a fantastic conclusion to a very engaging book. Yet the question here is regarding the overestimation of these categories as well. So for example, I would draw attention to the work of someone like Sartori, where he's talking about the distinct history of, let's say, the Muslim Rayat in Bengal, where the notion of the Rayat is obviously wedded to certain kinds of tenancy demands and an economic identity, but it can't be removed from the notion of the Muslim at the same time. So therefore, it's almost in this collaborative project. And to give you a more contemporary example, let's say the farmers' movement in India, which is being organized and fueled by the Khap Panchayats, but making extremely progressive and economic liberal demands on behalf of small-scale production in India. Now, the question is that to what extent do we look at tradition and secular projects to be complete binaries or dyads in the Indian context in the first place, given the fact that most secular projects have often used traditional idioms. And this is something which I would extend for a larger conversation regarding social movements in Asia as well. One can take examples from China in the Boxer Revolution as well, or even during the Taiping. To what extent do these divisions actually appear so stark in epistemological studies versus their real-time involvement in demand and claim-making processes. So I'm just going to end here. And I think maybe, Nikhil, if you want, you can start by addressing these questions, and then we can keep the floor open for further questions.
Thank you so much, Bershak, for reading the book, for your generous comments, and for these very, very thought-provoking questions. I have, I think, written down 5 of them, so I'll just try to quickly respond to them, and so that then we can open the floor to other questions. But let me know if you want clarification on any of my responses. I think your first question was about how the book, in the way in which it is organized and betrayed by the title itself, overdetermines the nature of the state being omnipresent in this narrative about the economy. But then you asked, what about the ways in which planning was impossible? What about the ways in which liminal, say, small capitalists or or capitalistic groups were involved in the planning vision? And in some ways, I think that the reason that they do not come in under the scope of my book, though I think that they deserve to be in different books on planning, is that in some ways my study was a study of the state's vision, and therefore looks at the subjects that come within this field of vision. And in this field of vision, the small capitalists, especially the small traditional capitalists of mercantilist groups, etc., are not part of the Nehruvian vision, are not part of the Mahalanobis plan. The Nehruvian or the Planning Commission vision for India in the 1950s and 60s is very much of large-scale industrial modernization. And as other scholars say, as Nasir Taibji has written in his book, part of the project of the Nehruvian years is to make these so-called laggards in the industrial progress, these sort of small capitalists and these sort of saukaris and these mercantilists, etc., bring that capital into the industrial fold. That actually it being left in these kind of hundis, etc., that's a sort of waste of capital, and that they need to be modernized. And so I think that's why when I'm studying, because I'm not studying the economy itself, but the representation of the economy through the planner's vision, that's why I think that they don't fall under the vision. But I think that in itself would be a great book to study, sort of small capitalism in sort of modern India, of the sort that sort of Doug Haynes has done for colonial India and part of post-colonial India as well. Your second question was about, what about the colonial antecedents? That my story begins very much in 1947, in some ways more in 1950, and I give some sort of background of what happens, especially with statistics beforehand and with the institutional antecedents to the Planning Commission in terms of the Planning and Development Department in 1944 with the British, etc. But I don't go very much into the ways in which the sort of numbered imagination, as Apadare would put it, of the colonial state, that in some ways already produces a kind of planning. And yes, you could go back to even the census, in the sort of 1870s and say that, that in some ways, once you have this level of data, there is going to be a certain level of quantitative methodology being used, once some level of intervention and planning exercised upon the populace. But I think that, and I mean, to take it even further, Mahalanobis himself recognized this. And while Mahalanobis would consistently write that planning in independent India was remarkably different from sort of pre-independence planning because of the kind of statistical infrastructure that was introduced, he would say that you could go back to even the reorganization of the administrative structure under Akbar, and say that that is also a kind of planning. So I think that I would concede that all of this exists on a spectrum, but my argument was that while it is all on a spectrum, if you just say it's a spectrum, it doesn't give you much analytical purchase on it. And for me, the purpose was to emphasize the transition between 1947 and 1952, in which, in those 5 years alone, you have suddenly the creation of a new kind of bureaucrat, which is a statistician. You have the creation of a central statistical organization. You have the creation of a national sample survey. You have the creation of the honorary statistical advisor of the government of India, who was Malanobis. All of these make a huge transformation in the way in which the state's capacities, right? So it is not without precedent, but it is a transformation in scale. And I think that transformation in scale makes a qualitative difference in the kinds of interventions that the state is capable of. And especially because there's also a leap intellectually, I mean, I'm not saying forward or backward, but a leap intellectually in terms of the kinds of methods used, which is sampling survey. And this is a leap that is noted by contemporaries in India, but also internationally as well. So I do think that there is a rupture, and that's all that I was trying to suggest with the argument in my book. I mean, your argument about the role of the Congress Party is really, I think, a stimulating one. It's, of course, one that scholars have written about for a long while. The argument of ye azadi jhuti hai, the argument that in some ways most iconically is made by Partha Chatterjee about the passive revolution of capital. I think that debate, I don't enter that debate about what the Congress therefore represents in terms of the movement or the role of capital in the country. But I think that that debate is still locked between the Partha Chatterjee formulation of planning being a way in which a sort of a bourgeois party sort of protects itself from the pressures of the populace to say that, yes, you can vote every 5 years in an election, but what happens in the economy will be treated as sort of a specialty subject that the Planning Commission, which is not an elected body, that the Planning Commission will decide for even elected representatives, right? So as Partha Chatterjee puts it, I mean, he doesn't put it as this, but he in a sense is saying that the Planning Commission provides a moat around these presumably sometimes unpopular decisions that are being made in the larger interests of industrial modernity. My argument, the wrinkle that I add to that, or my sort of slight disagreement with that, is that sort of overlooks the entire second half of what my book is trying to argue, which is that, yes, it might be protecting these decisions from popular pressures, but there is also a sort of bridge laid out over the moat, a way to address the populace, because you need the populace to participate in these plans. Because the Indian state, unlike, say, the Soviet state, and even the Soviet state was not capable of this, and the Indian state is certainly less powerful than the Soviet state, and the Indian state just cannot effect these plans without the populace participating in them, which is why you see an enormous amount of time and money and resources spent in having publicity officers in districts across the country. You have roving publicity officers, you have a 5-year planning publicity committee that exists for decades, and all of this is because the populace, even though you might not want their views on the economy, you still need their participation in these programs. So I do think that there is a way in which the Partha Chatterjee's formulation, I think that I would say that this is something that we could add to it. But I also think that another interesting view on this is Vivek Chibber's, who of course argues that the reason why the Planning Commission cannot be a revolutionary sort of body, or more radical at least, is because there are elements within the Congress Party who are pushing back against the kinds of powers that would be necessary to put through things like more aggressive industrial licensing, more aggressive export orientation, more aggressive land reforms, for example. And those include people like Patel within the Congress, but also the kind of influence that outside industrialists have on the Congress Party through donors, etc. Your question, I mean, I'll treat the question about the economy versus the market and the epistemological considerations of the sample surveys together. Those are both, I think, excellent questions. The ways in which that I agree, and I acknowledge that in the book, I treat the market and the economy sort of almost as synonyms, but they of course aren't. But again, the formation of the market as separate from the formation, as separate from the economy was not really something that I was interested in through this book. The epistemological considerations behind sample surveying, one of the reasons I didn't go into it is because I think that it's been done very well by another book that I would like to flag for others on China in the 1950s by Arnab Ghosh. Arnab Ghosh's book, I forget the title of the book, but a book by the China historian Arnab Ghosh at Harvard. His book is a study, or in a sense, the history of science study, and it's a study of statistics alone in the PRC in the 1950s. And he has a chapter or two comparing it to the Indian case. And so I think there you get a much better sense of the epistemological and the philosophical stakes for Marxists in sticking to plot enumeration as opposed to going through sample surveys. So I only sort of cite his work, and the reason I didn't go into it is because I think that it's already much better done by someone who's much more trained to do it than I am. And lastly, the question about tradition and modernity, you are right to put your finger on the point that modernity always comes from tradition, that they are not polar opposites, that one is embedded in the other, and that one should not make too much of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj being an organization that seems traditional, but is committed to something that is very secular, right? Seems something that is religious, but is committed to something secular. But in some way, what I was trying to do is and maybe I was trying to eat my cake and have it too. What I was trying to do is to try to suggest that it seems a very surprising scenario that you have sadhus who, as all of us have seen in India, are not people that you associated with industrial modernity and with propagating industrial modernity. That you have them engage in it, and that you have the Nehru government that you'd see as kind of antithetical to this kind of politics, being the party that is engaging these sadhus to participate in this kind of publicity machinery. But at the same time, what I wanted to also show is that this happens, and that it is not surprising today when you look around at the politics of India today, when you see that you can have technocratic, a party that sometimes tries to position itself as technocratic, but also having very sort of extreme Hindu nationalist beliefs as well, right? So that there is a backstory to this. And this is not to lay blame, so to speak, at the Congress's door, but to say that this has been a part of our politics in different ways, and that even politicians like Nehru were not immune to the charms of trying to see that, well, maybe it's harmless to do it in this fashion. Of course, he wouldn't live to see it blow up in the Congress's face, but despite his hesitation about it, he was convinced by people like Gulzar Nanda, who are not really communal in any way, but who are in fact, long-time Gandhians, but who are extremely devout, but who believed that these people could participate in this kind of project. But I think that it was meant more as a way of saying that this is possible, it has happened before, and that we shouldn't be surprised when we see it around us. Thank you very much again. Vaishak, I can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Nikhil. That was very comprehensive answers, and I think you answered all the questions, although you said you just noted down, or maybe you missed a couple, but I think you answered everything. Maybe just on a lighter note to end, and even to draw a lineage over here, what you were talking about Nehru, I think a former associate in this institute, Katrina Guenci, she starts her book with the fact that what is known as one of the most iconic lines of post-independent India, in the stroke of the midnight hour, was actually a time dictated by a body of astrologers that was gathered by the Nehru cabinet to actually give an auspicious time to the moment of independence. So these mixed metaphors in politics, I guess, is something which can be witnessed in every field. Okay, so let's open it up to questions from the audience. I think, sorry, yeah.
So we will certainly take questions from the floor, also from the audience online. So Niru, if you don't mind just opening the chat box so that we can see if there are any questions online, just to be fair on both sides. And for those of you who are in the room, If you can just approach the mics when you want to, ask your questions, that would be much better. So please just remember to press on the button and it has to turn red so that people online can actually hear you, including Nikhil, most importantly. Okay.
Thanks, Nikhil. I'm a Prajita. I have to use your book for my book proposal. It is one of those things I have to cite. So this question is coming from. Can you? This question is partly coming from jealousy because it's like he's done the work, but I think it's something that I'm struggling with too, which is that and coming back to Boishak's question about market, I think when we are talking about or tracing the archival trace of one figure and taking him as an entry point as the professor, are we also in the danger of constructing a consensual, an almost artificial consensual process of planning? And because it's something that the state keeps stressing on with its short films, with its massive infrastructural aesthetic project of like, see, this is a 5-year plan. It will keep it's like really throwing in the face of people that this is happening. You have to accept it every 5 years. So I was wondering, what are the dangers of this kind of archival work where you're entering with this one demographer, this one intelligentsia in that sense? And I wonder if there aren't actually 2 different books in this one book, because the first section has so much on scientific modernity, which seemed to me, which you could have unpacked a little bit more and actually theorized a little bit more. And the second half is about the intermediary characters. And to me, I think that is the next level of theorizing that this period of India, like post-colonial India needs, because we have had like 3 books on Mahalanobis, so enough with the guy, sorry. So thank you. So essentially my question is about the dangers of archiving around this one person.
We'll take maybe a round of questions so that, if you don't mind, Nikhil, so that we make sure that everyone gets to speak. So I think Jonathan and Stephanie. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Nikhil. Thank you for that fantastic talk. I really enjoyed the narrative trajectory of your talk, for especially a book that's called Planning and Democracy. I really enjoyed the range of sources that were quoted. I haven't read your book, but it sounds incredible. So it's 2 sources that interested me, and it comes in the first section of your talk. The section where you quoted the confidential report of the US Embassy, which tracks the journey of Professor Mahalanobis as he pursues India's, India, he wants to procure the digital computer for India. And it allowed me to recall Peter Hopkirk's book on Great Game. And, it recalled what Kipling was talking about. And because that's the political imagination which sets the context for conducting surveillance on this professor and the scientist as he's moving on. And it's a transoceanic journey in a way, and it's fascinating. I was interested in that because my research is very different from the time and the era that you're talking about, but the concept of transoceanic surveillance and how you saw the journey of this professor moving around, and what were the other perceptions that were generated as this surveillance was conducted. And another thing that interested me was your references to the cartoons by Shankar and Lakshman, and that showed, it flagged the question of political satire as how it used to exist, and it kinds of helps us see the meaning of political satire retrospectively as how it is probably existing now, or is perhaps erased slowly from public spheres and all of that. So political satire, how its meaning has changed, because I see, for instance, a trajectory that connects the Sadhu Samaj and the declaration of 25th December as Good Governance Day, for instance, right? So there's an erasure of sorts and a Hinduization, as we call, but there's a narrative trajectory that seemingly connects these 2 spaces, apparently. But yeah, the transoceanic surveillance is another thing that really interested me. So maybe a couple of words on that. Thank you.
I'll take maybe one more question, and then Nikhil, you will be given time to answer because it might be too much otherwise.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I haven't read the book yet, but I was very interested in the tension you describe and explore apparently between technocracy and democracy. And that reminded me of, I have been working on participatory democracy for some time. And I remember being very surprised at reading, I think it was in the 7th five-year plan, the one that came out during the Janata Party, that, you know, literally it was written, please do mobilize, please civil society, do mobilize, do watch bureaucrats, do demand accountability. And I found that extremely paradoxical and fascinating. And I was wondering whether you had, you know, written anything specific about it. The question really I have is, again, calls perhaps for speculation more than anything else, but it seems today that the plan has been replaced by the mission, or rather the missions into plural. This probably, I mean, this shift, I think the key word seemed to have happened probably somewhere in the 1990s. But I was wondering whether you have reflected on this shift, what is behind this, you know, change in the keywords. It's obviously not the length of the actual plan or mission, because we just had a seminar in Delhi last week about the Smart City mission, which started in 2015 and is going to last, I mean, was meant to last for 8 years. So basically, I mean, obviously the length is not at issue here, but what is really, and I would like very much to have your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Yeah, Niru, if you don't, just before cutting us, I have a follow-up question, so I'll take advantage of my position to ask a follow-up question following what Stephanie has just asked. Just to go back to this tension between technocracy and democracy. So one question I had at the back of my mind when you spoke was about what is the response of the people? Because, you know, you insist upon the importance of reaching out to the people, but it seems to be a one-way dialogue. I mean, in the sense, it's never a dialogue, really, it's a monologue. We have to make people follow the state, but what about the actual response of the people? So of course we have cartoonists, so that's one sample, but for example, to what extent did Congress leaders try to make the plan an object of political debates, for example, at the time of the elections, or did they try to make sure that it would not become an object of political debate precisely because they saw planning as something that stands above politics? You know, in the 50s, you have a lot of this dichotomy between politics as something a bit dirty or a matter of debate, and then science, or the greater good of the nation, that is something that is beyond political debate. And so my question is, to what extent does planning become an object of political debate? Does the Congress try to make it or not make it an object of political debate? And do you have any sources that tells you something about people's responses to this meta-narrative of planning? Thank you. Kiran, I promise you will get to ask your question. Yes, Himanshu.
Thank you very much for those questions all, and I hope I caught everyone's name. So the first question was from Prajita, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So Prajita, I seem to have annoyed you by you haven't had to read this book for your book proposal. My best wishes for the book proposal. I think that it's good that there are more books on Mahalanobis. I think that we need, the problem at the moment is not too many books on these figures. The problem is that perhaps too few people are reading them, or too few books are written on post-colonial India. I would say that you are right to say that every archival choice creates a kind of false consensus, but that is only a consensus of what the author believes in, right? So I think that I am limited by the sources that I choose to pick or that I have available to me, as I'm sure you will also be limited by the sources that you will pick for your book. And then that will leave out other sources. And that is just, I think, a challenge that we have to confront when you write the book, which is that you will not be able to reproduce the entire complexity of the archive. It's like the Borges story, right? That if you reproduce a map of the world in its entirety, then you have the entire world itself that you reproduce. And so I think that the consensus that I was trying to, but you're right that especially in choosing a figure like Mahalanobis, you can often sound like you're echoing his views and therefore echoing the views of a very powerful man at the time. And so what I tried to do through the book, I don't know if you had a chance to read through those chapters, but what I tried to do through this book is to try to, when I'm recounting the story, not the story because it's not a biography of Mahalanobis, but trying to recount the story vis-a-vis planning and statistics of Mahalanobis, I tried to undercut his narrative by sort of focusing on, in paragraphs here and there, on people that disagree with him, right? C.D. Deshmukh, who disagrees with him for a period, Tarlok Singh, who is like an enemy of his at the Planning Commission, the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, whose name suddenly escapes me, V.T. Krishnamachari, who's again a sort of enemy of his at the Planning Commission. I talk about the views of Meenu Masani. I talk about the views of the Swatantra Party, of Rajgopalachari, all of whom disagree fundamentally with Nehru, with Nehru and Mahalanobis vis-a-vis the 5-year plan. Also the views of Gandhi, right? And the views of Gandhians and how the plan in some ways is seen, the second 5-year plan is seen as a betrayal of Gandhian values. So I think that what I try to do is, again, it's up for the reader to decide whether it's successful or not, and perhaps it's unsuccessful, but what I try to do is to try to embed within the narrative itself criticisms of the Planning Commission and of Mahalanobis, such that the reader is aware that this is not just the only view at the time. It's also why, for example, I included a discussion of Kalyanashri, which is a sort of experiment that was conducted at the Indian Statistical Institute, but it was ostensibly for women, but has been subjected to a lot, and is, I think, liable to be subjected to a lot of feminist critique. And I look at why, for example, women do not have the same kind of role in the second 5-year plan that you might have thought that women might have had if you read the national planning documents of the 1940s that the Congress was producing, right? So these were different ways in which I tried to find ways to critique or to push back on the Mahalanobis narrative to make sure that it is apparent to the reader that this is not at all a consensus view, but that it is the view that comes out on top because of a coalition of interests that is very powerful, right? So I don't also want to give equal opportunity to all, because they did not have equal opportunity in the historical record. They were not as powerful. The combination of C.D. Deshmukh as finance minister, Nehru as prime minister, and Mahalanobis at the Planning Commission, in the end, was too powerful. And there was also, as I said, a very broad view in India, which is why the second 5-year plan has pushback from the left and the right, but it's only on the amounts. They're not disagreeing fundamentally with the idea that you needed import substitution industrialization. So that's what I would say on the archival choices. And also in the archival choices, I tried to, again, it's up to the reader to decide whether it's successful or not, but I tried to widen the source base to not just have the state's records, not just the archival records that are produced by the state, but also include things like, in the second part of the book, like novels, like plays, like cartoons, movies, etc., as a way to provide some texture that is not that of the state, to suggest ways in which others were thinking about planning, but very often still inflected by the ideas of planning. I'd love to know more about what you are working on and what research you are writing up. And so I look forward to learning more about that. The second question, was that by Jonathan? Did I get the name correct? Yes. Oh. Unfortunately, I don't have very much that I can offer more on transoceanic intelligence gathering. This was one of those lucky breaks at the archive. I found a reference to some, this is actually at Cambridge University, where they have some of these sources of the US State Department on file. And I found these declassified documents. They find these recordings of conversations between the US ambassador and Indian politicians as well. And in one of these sort of wires back and forth, I saw the name of Mahalanobis crop up. And the reason I was interested in it is because it was to do with these computers. And it gave me a sense of, again, how we often think of the story as people who either live in India or work on India or are Indian. We think of it just through a sort of purely Indian lens, but I think it's part of this global story. And I found it interesting to know how India's planning story intersected with these global stories. And I think through the figure of someone, say, Morton Adler, who I start the computer chapter with, through the objects of these computers themselves and the ways and their sheer cost, which made it a part of these international political calculations, I thought that it offered some insight into the way in which India plugged into this international matrix. But unfortunately, nothing more that I have to offer on the surveillance itself. The third question, if I'm not mistaken, was by Stephanie on technocracy and democracy. I'm actually not too surprised to hear that the five-year plan document under the Janata government argued for the mobilization of the people, even if it is, against the bureaucrats, etc. Because in some ways, that is what Janata represented, right? It represented a sort of shaking up of the old guard. But in a less sort of radical form, that is what the democratic planning rhetoric is doing. That is what the rhetoric of planning consciousness is doing in the 1950s and 60s. It is not asking people to take an oppositional stance towards government, but a stance of an enthusiastic backer or an enthusiastic ally. And I think that it sounds today hopelessly naive, but I suspect, and having spent a lot of time reading this, I suspect that it did not sound as hopelessly naive in the early 1950s to a population that had engaged for decades in an anti-colonial movement, right? That they are used to hearing this kind of exhortation from these very people. They're used to hearing Congress leaders asking them to participate in all kinds of things. Often it is be willing to go to jail, right? So in some ways, what this is arguing is that just because we've got independence does not mean that the task is over, that we need to participate in different ways still. And regarding the question about the change in terminology, you are right that it has changed from plans to missions to Niti Aayog, etc. I think that the language of planning had already, the shine had worn off from the late 1980s onwards, especially with the fall of the Soviet Union. Planning comes to be associated increasingly with outmoded ideas, comes to be increasingly associated with ideas that have failed, and it's sort of in the place of its place of its founding, as it were, in the Soviet Union. And so I think that, but also I think for the Modi government, there was a clear emphasis on just making cosmetic changes as well, because it marked a change from the past. It marked that 2014 would be a change from all governments that came before. As Modi himself would say, it brought an end, as he put it, to Hazar Saal ki Gulami, right? So if you're bringing an end to such an epochal change, surely small things like five-year plans have to change their names. And so I would argue that in the initial years, there has not been, between the five-year plans, between the Planning Commission of 2013 and the Niti Aayog today, again, based on what experts say, not that much has changed in the way it operates, because of the Planning Commission had already become a purely advisory technocratic body and not a sort of powerful political body as it was in the 1950s. But I'd say that's why I think that a lot of this terminology has undergone changes. I mean, in some ways, it's just like the roads in Delhi having name changes as well. Laurence, your question, what is the response of the people? Excellent question, valid to expect of the book. And I searched high and low for it, but I guess it's a failing of mine as a researcher that I just couldn't find very much more, apart from things like cartoonists, apart from opposition leaders and what they would quote of what they claim their constituents told them. Sometimes in newspapers, I would find, like I said, and which is why I quoted them, letters to the editor by ordinary citizens. Again, this suggests an elite citizen that writes into Times of India. I did, for example, on a quote from Yojana magazine, interviews done by the editor of sort of so-called people on the street of what they thought of these films that came out that had planning-based themes. And so there's a few pages on that as well. So those are the ways in which I tried to give a flavor of what the citizenry might have thought of this. But in some ways, it is a weakness of the book that it reflects the planning imagination in that it does not have the view from below. But that is, there was just not a, and so, for example, very often I was sort of jealous of Rohit Dey's book, in which you have these sort of public interest litigations and these petitions, but the petition allows you to get the voice from below. But in some ways, unlike the Supreme Court, the Planning Commission was much more deaf to the voices, and therefore did not create avenues for this kind of interaction. The one exception being the university and college planning forums. So St. Stephen's College still has a planning forum, and the planning forum in St. Stephen's College is a vestige of an era where most central universities and colleges in the country had either a university or college planning forum. And the, again, naive idea of the planning forum in the 1950s and 60s was that, say you were in Delhi University's North Campus at, say, Hindu, Kirorimal, Ramjas, etc., you would have a planning forum on these campuses. And at the planning forum, it was meant to be a debating society for debating aspects of national development. So presumably you would get an early draft of the second five-year plan, and you would debate what you thought worked and didn't work in the second five-year plan. And the best ideas would get distilled upwards to the university planning forum, which would then go to a North Indian conglomeration of planning forums. And then the best ideas across the country would be presented by the executive of the planning forums to presumably, to Yojana Bhavan. But of course, none of that happened. The planning forums ended up being sort of quite lively for the 50s and 60s, but they were just debating societies. But that was meant to be the one way in which the intelligentsia, the young intelligentsia of the country, could have this kind of feedback loop with the Planning Commission. And the fact that they just ended up as kind of boyish debating clubs gives us a sense of how seriously that feedback loop was taken. But thank you all so much for those questions. I hope I answered them. I'm happy to clarify further if you desire.
So I think even though it is already quite late, if you don't mind, we will take one more round of questions, because there are quite a few people who raised their hands in the room at least. So Kiran, Himanshu, Joel, is there a burning question in the online, among the online audience? No, so yes, one. So we will be fair. Yes, there is. Okay, so Vikas, if you do not mind, we will certainly let you ask your questions. So since Kiran has raised her hand a long time ago. Oh, okay. So Vikas, if you don't mind, what I'll do is I'll just read out your question. It will be easier, and then we will take the live questions. So how we develop the idea of development as governance after independence and its influence on government in 2019. So how did we develop the idea of development as governance? Okay, so Nikhil, you can also see the question. So I will let you answer it after the others ask their question. So Kiran, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I can't see the question. Is the question put some light on?
Oh, sorry, I thought you could. Niru, would you mind just copy pasting it and putting it in the chat box so that everyone can see it? Because it's true, yeah, it's only addressed to us. So of course you won't see it. So we will just, Niru will copy paste it and put it in the chat box. In the meantime, maybe Kiran, you can ask your question.
Yeah, my question is also, sort of in the same kind of category of questions around the tension between technocracy and democracy, but perhaps a little bit more in terms of, you talk about, and, we all know that the whole planning process was a central piece in the nation building project and in the idea of gaining state legitimacy for a newly independent nation state. And even I would say, part of giving the idea which in the Constitution of having a sort of Republican notion of citizenship, where the citizenry is, sort of also contributes to the idea of a common good and development being the common good, and therefore the need to have citizens sort of buy into this project. And as you also mentioned, the carrying, the whole planning process. So in that, I'm just wondering, for me, I work on education. So the thing that really strikes me as a kind of tension in this whole sort of framework of understanding around that time is the neglect of human development in the planning process. So I'm just wondering whether, you came across that also somewhere, or have you looked at it, or was that, anywhere one of the questions that you address? And in the same sort of an associated question is, and again related to the idea of, both democracy, state legitimacy, citizenship, etc., the distribution of resources, particularly towards the minorities, for instance, have shown over the years of the planning process, highly skewed distribution. And especially now that you have talked about the Sadhu Samaj and the involvement of the, the Hindu clergy in a sense, I'm just beginning to wonder whether it's not just about modernity and tradition, and whether there is another tension actually that might have been sort of began in the early days, but seems to have clearly been kind of built into the whole process in terms of the distribution of resources particularly.
Yeah, actually two questions, but let me first begin with the whole notion of democracy, in a sense, the planning process.
So your name, sir?
My name is Himanshu. So I think the question is, to what extent this whole Mahalanobis idea of plan, in a sense, was so esoteric that it was bound to be anti-democratic, in a sense, made it so opaque. I mean, in fact, the second plan document, first plan document, all the documents were so mathematical. I doubt if anybody in the Congress party could make sense of, forget about the general population. Even the bureaucrats would not be able to make sense of these plan documents. And in that sense, it became kind of so far away from the party itself, or from the political process itself, because it was seen as something which was very, very technocratic and sophisticated and something. And that became the problem, in a sense, that you could not communicate. So the only campaign you could have is to propagate the plan. But what was the plan? Nobody knew, because it was basically, it meant too many things which were so the way it was presented. And I think that is where I think the problem comes in, where Modi breaks down. And instead of propagating the plan, you now have the different schemes being propagated by the leader, like the Beti Bachao to Swachh Bharat to, so they are being broken down. So the messaging, political messaging in that sense, is much easier when you are basically directly approaching the message, which is simple to communicate, rather than having that something like you have an encyclopedia which nobody knows how to read. I think that's something which, so to what extent was that responsible for that? Nehru depending more on the Sadhu Samaj or on this kind of a campaign, was it responsible? Second, I think, is the nature of the functioning, in the sense, the planning commission, the way it functioned. I mean, remember Modi's objection was not that the plan had a problem, in a sense. The content of it has not changed. I mean, they're basically following the same, I would say, the plans, in a sense, or the same schemes. Basically, the problem was that it, in a sense, which is what you refer to also, is that you had this annual ritual of an elected chief minister being called to the Yojana Bhavan and made to parade through the narrow corridors of planning commission, and really bow down to an unelected person asking for money. And that was something which will be flashed on television screens. And I think it was something which is, the planning commission will insist that the chief minister had to come, not the chief secretary had to come. And you can see that in a sense, planning commission was basically digging its grave by perpetuating this thing. There is no other process where an elected chief minister or an elected person has to really demean himself or herself to that extent, and that also in Delhi. So, to what extent, are these processes linked? And was there a realization that the whole problem was not with the plan? All countries had plans. You call it socialist, communist, or even, I would say, even pre-independence, as you mentioned, there was a plan. But the problem was the complexity, and what you say as the professor and the institution were really the problem, which basically made it undemocratic rather than making it democratic. To what extent were these factors being talked about then in the 50s, 60s, or even in the corridors of, for example, the member of parliaments, or were they actually discussing the bare details of it, or there was some resentment on these issues?
Last question, Joël, and after this, Nikhil, we will give you 5 minutes to answer all these very complex questions. All the best.
Hi, Nikhil. Same as other people, I'm sorry, I haven't read the book, but I'm really interested and I will. It's a very large question and it's maybe a little off the grid, regarding the little time we have left. So I'll just be very brief. So how do you engage with the caste, or how do you locate the caste question in planning and the anti-caste movements in the country, such as the Ambedkar movement, for example, and a great planner and economist himself, such as Ambedkar? So how do you actually locate him in this whole story? I'm not necessarily, talking of interpersonal relations with Mahana Lobis, but in general, in the idea of planning, considering he wrote different pieces, he participated to river valley development projects such as the Damoda, which was even in some of the cartoons I think you showed. So, again, it's a too wide question. It's maybe a bit, off the point right now, but if you can, just how do you locate caste into this whole planning thing?
I'm sorry, Lawrence, I didn't hear you.
All the best. Now your turn. You have to answer all these questions in 5 minutes.
That was just you gloating at my misery. All right. But thank you all so much for these questions. Like Lawrence said, I might not have time enough to answer all of them, but I really appreciate all of these questions and the earlier questions as well. I really appreciate you sticking around, listening to me, and sort of engaging with what I had to say. Vikas, your question was about how did the idea of development as governance begin, and what is its influence on government in 2019? I think that is an interesting change in terminology adopted by the government, which is that Indian governments used to talk about development. Today we talk about governance, and I think that that is a change in the bar that the government is setting for itself, right? If development is the goal that you're putting ahead, then you could ask questions of the government, like as say Kiran suggested, where is the education, where is the healthcare, etc. Whereas if governance is all that you're expecting, then governance sounds more like law and order, like making sure there's no corruption, making sure that service delivery is good. But it sort of, I think, lowers the bar. And I think that governance is now seen as a sort of more modern way of projecting what the government should do. But I think that the claim of development was a higher bar and a more radical bar to reach. And I think that it reflects a diminution in what the state sees as its role vis-a-vis the citizens. And I think that is worth noting. Kiran, your question about the neglect of human development, unfortunately, it's not something that I go into in the book. The book, as I sort of say in the introduction, is not a sort of assessment of the 5-year plans themselves, but it is one of the big questions about planning in general, right? I'm now speaking just as a sort of lay Indian who studied some of this planning stuff. The biggest failures of the Nehruvian government and sort of signal and perhaps unforgivable error is the neglect of primary healthcare and education. It is just a sort of gargantuan oversight, and an oversight that I think that there are different theories that we could come up with for why that is. One is that, unfortunately, the best advice at the time, even the best experts at the time, whether development economists, etc., were not necessarily recommending it. Ironically, it is a country that is much less free, but the PRC invests in healthcare and education in a way that India doesn't, and that by the 1980s redounds the benefit of China as opposed to India. It could be also, as some people have said, the fact that you have these, and this links to Joel, your question as well, that you have these very elite upper caste men who are making these decisions. And so what they're looking to do is replicate people like themselves. Nehru is reliant on people like Mahalanobis, Homi Bhabha, Meghnad Saha, etc. And where do these, sorry, Meghnad Saha is not the best example, but Homi Bhabha, Sarabhai, Mahalanobis, etc. And these are all upper caste, very elite men who basically trained abroad, right? And have come from very rich families. And so in some ways, if you're looking for mini Mahalanobises and mini Sarabhais, you're not going to be investing in primary education and primary healthcare, and that perhaps was seen as I think an oversight at the time. I was also looking as a sort of side project at this this effort done by the government of India on it was called, I think, manpower planning. And in manpower planning, the entire idea was that you can build a factory in 10 years, you can build all these other things in like 10 to 15 years, but the thing that takes the longest gestation period is quote unquote manpower, or having skilled manpower, which meant that would take about 30 years. But even in that, there is, I think, the temptation for the government of India was that we cannot wait 30 years, so we should instead focus on a sort of cadre of already very elite, already very educated people, and that those are the people that will sort of help us haul us out of this underdevelopment towards development. So I think that those are, again, though I've not studied it, that those I think would go into the sort of distribution mix or ingredients of this catastrophe, in my view. Himanshu, your question, and you're right that in some ways, planning and the language of planning is too esoteric to be democratic. But my sort of, what I wonder about that is there any language of economics that does not sound necessarily that esoteric, like the free hand of the market, the invisible hand of the market? I think that it might be a bit unfair to compare the sort of marketing successes of the Modi government to that of the Nehru government, purely because we're talking about 70 years, a difference of 70 years. I mean, a modern day government, firstly, the Indian government today is much, much, much richer than it was in the past, on just per capita terms, etc. Resources available to the government. It has an outreach, an ability to outreach to people. Yes, you're right that, snappy terms like Beti Bachao, Beti Badhao, I mean, all of these things are ways in which the Modi government reaches out to the populace, but also it is able to put that message on everyone's smartphone that, maybe 600 or 800 million people have in their homes. And those are not things that in a country in which very, very few people have even transistor radios, that is much harder then, right? Or then having televisions is also a very small percentage of the population. So I think that the state capacity is a big difference as well. I think that even if the Modi government had a 5-year plan, they would be much better at being able to communicate it in 2022 than you would in 1956, just because of the transformation in technology, etc. But I think that there is you are right to say that that there is a way in which I mean, since we're comparing Nehru and Modi, the Modi government is able to come up with marketing mechanisms that seem much more vernacular and homespun than the language of the 5-year plan was, and less alienating than the language of the Planning Commission. But at the same time, I don't want to let the Nehru government and the Mahalanobis sort of led Planning Commission off the hook, because surely there are ways to make that thick, fat, 5-year plan book into digestible messages for the people. And perhaps that is a failure of political communication, and one that the Nehru government was not good enough at doing. And therefore, it is forced to resort to things like the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. But I don't know if there is necessarily, there are good economic ideas, quote unquote, good economic ideas that are necessarily easier to digest. I mean, surely there are some things like, deciding what level of deficit financing the government should be investing in, should be engaging in, that can't necessarily be made easier. But surely the government should find ways to make other things more palatable to its citizens in general. But I absolutely agree with you about CMs being asked to walk the corridors of Yojana Bhavan, and that being really, I mean, and it's something that many people have pointed out that Modi especially really chafed against, that this is something that Modi remembered and did not enjoy, that this was an extremely powerful chief minister, perhaps after 2002, especially the most famous chief minister in the country. But he is still, till 2014, he has to come every few years to Yojana Bhavan and come to and ask someone who he thinks of as a political, in comparison, politically not at all at the same level, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and he has to go sort of hat in hand, asking for funds. This would have, I think, been a different scenario, and I think it's not a scenario that came up in the Congress's mind very much in the 1950s. It doesn't come up, I think, very much till 1967, which is the first time that Congress loses a lot of state governments, right? Before then, you still had Congress chief ministers coming. And so when you had Congress chief ministers coming and on the planning commission, you had, someone like Nehru still on the planning commission, and Nehru himself lended his personal prestige and staked his political sort of fortunes with the planning commission. It was not so much to expect that chief ministers would come and make this request. But I think that especially after that, it becomes, I think, a real power imbalance. And I think rubs elected representatives the wrong way. Joel, your question about how do we locate caste, this is again a question that I asked myself, and I struggled to come up with an adequate response to, and I think that the book reflects that. The trouble for me was twofold. One is that you're talking about, especially in the first part of the book, actors who are almost uniformly upper caste. And it is in studying what they're doing, you're studying a state discourse that has been cleansed of caste, right? That these documents that you're using just don't mention caste at all. And it's again a huge failure of these documents, that they only address economic, sort of quote unquote purely economic questions without looking at how they're embedded in social structures and power structures. And so to them, industrial modernity in itself would be the disinfectant that would get rid of all these kind of caste issues. And so in the source base, it's very hard to find material on how caste plays into it. But where I did try to address caste a bit is, well, apart from pointing out the fact that everyone just refers to Nehru at this time as Panditji, a very casteist language, right? I mean, you refer to him by the fact that he's a Brahmin. And I think it's, as I say in the book, it's just by force of caste habit that Indians just refer to the most powerful person in the country who happens to be a Brahmin as basically Brahmin, right? That's what we're referring to when we call him Panditji. But apart from that, when I talk about the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, I talk about how the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, again, this organization that is meant to be an organization of outreach, that is getting money from the central government to engage in this outreach on 5-year plans, is at the same time when I think a journalist in the 80s and 90s asked them about their practices, they say that we're willing to admit people across all kinds of people, not just sadhus anymore, into the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. And so then the journalist probes further and says, well, what about this caste and that caste? And they say, yes, even them, except Shudras, right? So that is where they draw the line. Like that, if you are Dalit, then you cannot be a part of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. Also, if you're a woman, you cannot be a part of the main Bharat Sadhu Samaj. You're to be a part of this other sort of part that's hived off for women or sadhvis alone. So you see that, and in fact, there is a Bharat Sadhu Samaj event in Gujarat that is picketed by Dalits who are arguing against the Bharat Sadhu Samaj not allowing them into it as well. So these are some of the few things that I mentioned, but unfortunately, it is a book that is unable to, again, out of personal failing or archival, I'll let for the reader to decide, is unable to grapple with this question in other ways.
Thank you, Nikhil, for taking up the challenge. I think now we've already used much of your time, and it's still early morning for you, but you've given us 2 hours of your precious time. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to the CSH this evening. Thank you, Boishak, also for discussing the book in such depth and with such details and enthusiasm. That was fantastic. Thank you to the audience for all your questions. And before we close the session, I would just like to announce our next event, which will take place on our next seminar session, which will take place on the 13th of February. So Nidhin Donald from IIT Mumbai will come to speak on endogamy and Christianity in Kerala, analyzing the Knanaya debate, sorry. Thank you again, Nikhil, and have a very good day.
Thank you so much, Laurence. Thank you, Boishak, and thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.